Walter Cronkite was America's trusted voice. JFK was the nation's beloved president. On screen, they seemed like allies. Behind the scenes, they clashed constantly. Kennedy once tried to cancel an interview after filming ended. He went over Cronkite's head to network bosses. Cronkite stormed into Kennedy's hotel room, furious. The president thought more about image than substance. The newsman noticed it all. For decades, their secret battles stayed hidden. Today, we reveal what really happened between these American icons. Walter Cronkite was born in Missouri in 1916. He was an only child. His father was a dentist. His mother stayed at home. They moved to Kansas City, then Houston, but he always called Kansas City home. As a kid, Walter was curious. He kept notebooks, read encyclopedias, and asked questions no one else did. In high school, he edited the school paper, joined student government, and even won a state journalism award. He also worked odd jobs because his parents were struggling with money. He went to the University of Texas in 1933, but dropped out 2 years later to work full-time in newspapers. In 1937, he joined United Press. That's where things took off. During World War II, he trained with the military as one of only 8 combat reporters. He flew on bombing missions over Germany and reported from the front lines in Normandy and the Battle of the Bulge. After the war, he helped set up bureaus across Europe and became the Moscow bureau chief. Everything he went through in those years shaped him into the man who would later be called the most trusted voice in America. John F. Kennedy was born into a completely different world. He had money, power, and family connections, but his body was falling apart before he could even talk. He got sick all the time. Scarlet fever, stomach problems, endless infections. His weight dropped dangerously low in his teens. Doctors couldn't figure it out. Later, they diagnosed him with colitis, though it was likely celiac disease. He tried all sorts of treatments, including pellets under his skin. That helped a bit, but also gave him weak bones. In 1947, while in England, he was finally told he had Addison's disease. Things got worse in 1954 when a bone in his back collapsed. He needed crutches. He was in constant pain. He had risky spine surgery and told his dad he'd rather die than live like that. But somehow, he still became a war hero. In 1943, a Japanese destroyer rammed his boat. Kennedy swam for 5 hours, dragging a wounded crewman with a strap clenched in his teeth. That moment would follow him forever. He was sick, weak, and always in pain, but also brave beyond belief. In 1960, something new happened in American politics. For the first time, people weren't just listening to presidential debates, they were watching them on television. Millions of eyes were on the screen as Senator John F. Kennedy faced off against Vice President Richard Nixon. But long before the cameras rolled, a quiet tug-of-war was happening behind the scenes, and Walter Cronkite was in the middle of it. Cronkite had lined up a series of interviews with both candidates on CBS. He wanted to be fair. He knew that whoever went first might be at a disadvantage. So he asked Nixon if he was okay going first. Nixon didn't hesitate. "That's all right," he said. "Perfectly all right." But when Cronkite told Kennedy, things got tense. Kennedy didn't believe him. "He hasn't agreed to it," he snapped. "What are you telling me?" It was a small moment, but it showed something bigger. Kennedy was cautious, maybe even suspicious, but he was also learning quickly. Kennedy finally agreed to do the interview. But when it aired, he wasn't happy. He thought he didn't do well. Right after filming ended, he told CBS to cancel it. Then he went around Cronkite and called the network bosses. He wanted to redo the whole thing. Cronkite was furious. He stormed up to Kennedy's room, where the senator was lying on his back next to his speechwriter. Cronkite didn't yell. He made a deal. Kennedy could redo the interview, but CBS would run a message on screen saying it was his second try. That stopped Kennedy cold. He knew how that would look. So he gave in. He let them air the original, unedited interview. That moment changed Kennedy. He realized how powerful TV really was. He started preparing like never before. He rehearsed answers, memorized facts, and practiced looking calm. Nixon, on the other hand, didn't take the cameras seriously. He wore a light suit that made him blend into the background. He didn't use makeup. Under the hot studio lights, he looked pale, tired, and sweaty. Kennedy, in a dark suit with perfect lighting, looked strong and confident. When Chicago's mayor saw Nixon on screen, he joked, "My God, they've embalmed him before he even died." Kennedy knew how to use television, and he used it well. By the third debate, he had it mastered. He could talk directly to the camera like he was talking to you. He seemed natural, even when every word was planned. On October 13th, Kennedy was in New York and Nixon was in Los Angeles. They were debating from different cities, but it didn't matter. Kennedy looked right into the lens and spoke with ease. He talked about foreign policy, about the Chinese islands of Quemoy and Matsu, and he made it sound smooth and honest. Cronkite, watching it all, later said those debates changed everything. It was a new kind of politics. But once Kennedy was elected, Cronkite started seeing things differently. On TV, Kennedy looked like a hero. Off camera, Cronkite thought he was something else. Terribly self-centered, Cronkite said later, to a point of a certain kind of egotism. He noticed that Kennedy had trouble working with Congress. Many lawmakers didn't like how fast he had risen. They didn't think he earned it. And Kennedy didn't make it easier. He struggled to get things passed. A lot of his big ideas only became law after he died. Even his foreign policy seemed shaky. In one interview, Kennedy said, "This has got to be the war of Vietnam. They've got to understand that this can't be our war." But later, he did the opposite. He sent more troops. He made it America's war. Cronkite remembered that clearly. He thought Kennedy's actions didn't match his words. Still, most Americans didn't see that side. They saw the Kennedy that Cronkite showed on the evening news. Young, confident, good-looking, the man who won the debate by showing up ready. The man who beat Nixon not with better ideas, but with better lighting, sharper suits, and a cooler face under pressure. Walter Cronkite had seen political spin before, but nothing prepared him for what happened in April 1961. That's when the Bay of Pigs invasion became one of the biggest failures in United States foreign policy, and a moment Cronkite never forgot. Journalists at CBS and the New York Times already knew about the planned attack. American-trained Cuban exiles were preparing to land and overthrow Fidel Castro, but the Kennedy administration told them to stay quiet. It was a matter of national security, they said. Cronkite later called it an appeal to patriotism. The Times backed off. So did CBS. And that silence may have helped the plan move forward. Years later, Kennedy himself admitted, "If the New York Times had printed that, perhaps we would never have gone to the Bay of Pigs." The invasion was a disaster. Castro's forces were ready. The attackers were either killed or captured. Cronkite said it crushed any chance of peace between Cuba and the United States, and it deeply wounded the young president, who was still finding his footing in office. A year later, Kennedy made another move, but this time in secret. On July 26, 1962, the New York Times published a front-page story. It said the Soviets were building concrete covers for their missile sites. The article also exposed what United States spy cameras could really see. That same day, Robert Kennedy told the FBI to start tapping phones. First, a secretary at the Times office. Then, the reporter's home in New York. This quickly turned into something much bigger. 1 month later, on August 22nd, Kennedy met with CIA Director John McCone. He told him to begin surveillance on journalists. The CIA wasn't supposed to spy inside the United States, but that didn't stop them. The plan became known as Project Mockingbird. All senior staffers with access to classified information were told to write down every single interaction with the press. Years later, in 2007, documents about the operation became public. The New York Times wrote that long before Nixon built his own leak-stopping unit, Kennedy had tried to do the same with the CIA. The program lasted until 1965 and targeted journalists across the country. Among them were well-known columnists like Robert S. Allen and Paul Scott. It set a dark example for future presidents. Cronkite's own relationship with Kennedy was complicated from the start. In one interview, Cronkite recalled how Kennedy once complained about being seated on a soft sofa during a TV interview. Kennedy said it made him look weak, not presidential. Cronkite was stunned. To him, the president seemed more concerned about appearances than substance. He also noticed Kennedy had a habit of answering before a question was finished. Cronkite said it was probably because Kennedy had a fast mind, but it still annoyed him. He also didn't like how the president controlled the media. During the Cuban Missile Crisis in October 1962, CBS and others only got bits and pieces of the story. Everything came from the White House. It was filtered, controlled, one-sided. Cronkite later said there was so much happening behind the scenes that reporters never got to see. That tension stayed with him throughout Kennedy's time in office. But the public never saw any of this. They saw a strong, youthful leader. What they didn't know was that Kennedy was fighting a brutal war inside his own body. During those tense October days of the missile crisis, the president was taking a cocktail of drugs. He took antispasmodics for colitis, antibiotics for a urinary infection, steroids like hydrocortisone, and testosterone to manage his adrenal problems. He took salt tablets to stay balanced, painkillers, tranquilizers like Librium, sleeping pills, even amphetamines like Ritalin. On paper, he was a walking pharmacy. Behind closed doors, Kennedy was in constant pain, especially from his back, which had been injured years earlier. Some of the drugs he took likely made that worse. One condition people talked about was Addison's disease. When historian Arthur Schlesinger Jr. asked him directly in 1959, Kennedy said, "No one who has the real Addison's disease should run for the presidency, but I do not have it." Technically, he was telling the truth. Addison's disease, as first defined, had to involve tuberculosis of the adrenal glands. Kennedy didn't have that, but he did have adrenal insufficiency, and he did need constant steroid treatment to function. That treatment probably caused his bones to weaken, especially in his spine. On November 22, 1963, something happened that changed television forever. It was 1:40 p.m. on the East Coast when CBS cut into a soap opera to deliver a news bulletin. Just 10 minutes earlier, shots had been fired at President John F. Kennedy in Dallas. But back then, things weren't as simple as flipping on a camera. The studio cameras needed time to warm up, at least 20 minutes. So Walter Cronkite, the most trusted voice in America, had to go live with just his voice. No picture, no face, just audio over a black screen that read, CBS News Bulletin. People at home heard Cronkite speak calmly, even though behind the scenes, chaos was unfolding. He read the first bulletin, then a second, and then a third. First, there were shots. Then Kennedy had been hit. And finally, reports that the president might be dead. But Cronkite didn't say it was official. He held back. He waited. At 2 p.m., the cameras finally turned on. Cronkite appeared on screen without his jacket, looking tense and out of breath. But he kept going. For almost an hour, he updated the nation, never letting emotion take over. Then, at exactly 2:38 p.m., everything changed. Cronkite looked at the camera and read the words from the Associated Press wire. From Dallas, Texas, The Flash, apparently official. President Kennedy died at 1 p.m. Central Standard Time. He looked at the clock and said, "Some 38 minutes ago." Then he took off his glasses, blinked, cleared his throat. For just a second, his voice cracked. Millions of Americans saw it. The most composed man on television was breaking. That tiny moment, barely a pause, showed the whole country it was okay to feel something. Over the next 4 days, Cronkite didn't stop. He stayed on air for almost 72 hours straight. He guided the nation through shock, grief, and confusion. It wasn't just reporting anymore. It was history being written in real time. All 3 major networks aired non-stop coverage. People across the country watched together. They grieved together. They searched for meaning together. And Cronkite became more than a journalist. He became a mirror for the American soul. On the night of Kennedy's funeral, he spoke softly to the camera and said, "Only history can write the importance of this day." He asked whether this dark moment might somehow lead to a sunrise of understanding. Then he added something even deeper, something that stuck with people. Tonight, there will be few Americans who will go to bed without carrying with them the sense that somehow they have failed. Those words helped shape how Kennedy would be remembered, not just as a man, but as a symbol of hope that never got to grow. Behind the scenes, though, Cronkite was struggling. He was exhausted, torn between being a reporter and being human. He wanted to cry, but he didn't. Not fully. He held it together for everyone watching. Others cracked. NBC's Chet Huntley was openly angry. ABC's Ron Cochran shook on air. But Cronkite stayed steady. Even when CBS got early reports saying Kennedy was dead, he didn't rush. Dan Rather was sure. CBS Radio had already said it. But Cronkite waited. He kept saying, "These are only reports." He didn't call it official until The Wire did. And even then, he said, "apparently official." That small word, apparently, showed who he was. Walter Cronkite had seen it all. He was there when Kennedy was rising, and he was there when it all came crashing down. But years later, when people were still painting JFK as a saint, Cronkite quietly raised an eyebrow. In one CBS interview, he said it flat out. Kennedy didn't really know how to work with Congress. Most of his biggest laws? They got passed after he was gone. That wasn't magic. That was Lyndon B. Johnson pulling the strings. When Johnson signed the Civil Rights Act in 1964, he looked straight into the camera and said it was Kennedy's dream. But behind the scenes, most experts agreed. If JFK had still been alive, that bill might have died on the floor. Johnson didn't just push it through. He bulldozed it. And that was just the beginning. Over the next 2 years, Johnson pushed through 200 major laws. That included Medicare, Medicaid, education funding, and even environmental protections. Cronkite, who had a front-row seat to Washington, knew what was really happening. Johnson was turning the country's mourning into momentum. Kennedy got the credit. Johnson got the results. But not every shift of power went smoothly. On February 27, 1968, Cronkite flew to Vietnam. He saw the chaos after the Tet Offensive and came back with a verdict that shocked the nation. He said America was stuck in a stalemate. Coming from Cronkite, it hit hard. Johnson reportedly said, "If I've lost Cronkite, I've lost Middle America." But there was a bigger contradiction hiding underneath. Just a few years earlier, Kennedy had taken a very different path. In October 1963, he signed a document, NSAM 263, that laid out plans to pull 1,000 troops out of Vietnam by the end of that year. He even approved a full withdrawal by 1965. And he wasn't waiting for a victory. That was the plan: win or lose. But after his assassination, the plan vanished. Johnson took over, and by 1965, the United States wasn't just advising anymore, it was fighting. That year ended with 185,000 American troops on Vietnamese soil. Kennedy started with 16,000. Johnson turned it into a war. So when Cronkite called it a stalemate, it wasn't just about the fighting. It was a reminder of what might have been. Then there were the things Cronkite didn't say. He was America's most trusted newsman, but he never told the public about Kennedy's affairs, especially not the rumors about Marilyn Monroe. He knew, of course. Everyone in the press circles did. There were whispers of a secret weekend with Monroe at Bing Crosby's house. There was a recording, a phone call Monroe allegedly made to Jackie Kennedy, and that infamous moment when she sang "Happy Birthday" in a dress that looked painted on. Jackie skipped that night entirely. She went to a cookout instead. Monroe, by some accounts, thought the relationship was serious. Whether it was or wasn't, Cronkite stayed silent. That was the rule back then. You didn't report on the president's private life, no matter how explosive the story was. And so, Kennedy's image stayed clean, at least in public. But Cronkite wasn't blind. And as time passed, the doubts started to show. He began to wonder if he had helped polish a version of Kennedy that wasn't real. In another interview, he said Kennedy was terribly self-centered and carried a kind of egotism. That's a long way from the Camelot myth that Americans were sold. Cronkite had been the voice of those 4 dark days in November 1963. His calm voice had told the nation when Kennedy died. His glasses came off. His eyes dropped. Millions remember that moment. At the end of his 4-day coverage, he said maybe, just maybe, Kennedy's death could bring Americans together. In October 1972, Walter Cronkite went on air with a risky 2-part story about the Watergate scandal. At the time, not many people in the media were taking it seriously. But Cronkite did. He gave it 22 minutes of primetime coverage on CBS. That decision changed everything. It pushed the story into the national spotlight. Even the editor of the Washington Post, Ben Bradley, later said that once Cronkite covered it, people finally started paying attention. He called it a turning point. That report earned Cronkite an Emmy. He called it the Big Doozy, and it meant more to him than any other award he ever got. But there was something deeper happening too. Cronkite had changed. He was no longer the newsman who once admired charm and image. He was now focused on facts, substance, and holding power accountable, something he admitted he didn't always do back when John F. Kennedy was in the White House. Years later, Cronkite released his memoir, A Reporter's Life. It wasn't just another book. It was a bombshell. In it, he finally opened up about what JFK was really like behind the scenes. The world had always seen Kennedy as smooth, clever, and full of charisma. But Cronkite painted a different picture. He said Kennedy was terribly self-centered. Not just confident, but ego-driven. The kind of person who needed to be in control and didn't work well with Congress at all. That last part was key, because Kennedy's public image had always been about leadership and getting things done. But Cronkite revealed that most of JFK's major laws were passed after he died. The image was fake, and Cronkite had helped sell it. His memoir wasn't just a look back, it was a confession. He admitted that the press, including himself, had played a role in building the myth of Camelot. Then, in 2003, 40 years after Kennedy's assassination, Cronkite went even further. On CBS's The Early Show, he looked straight into the camera and said it again. JFK was terribly self-centered. It shocked people. This was the same man who had once choked up on air while announcing Kennedy's death. Back then, he had taken off his glasses, his voice had cracked, and the whole country had cried with him. But now, he wasn't afraid to speak the truth. Still, he didn't completely tear Kennedy down. He gave him credit for standing strong during the Cuban Missile Crisis. That was his finest hour, Cronkite said. It gave people faith in him again. But the rest? Not so much. He said Kennedy hadn't done much before that, and he struggled to lead Congress. These weren't just bitter words from an old man. They were honest reflections, sharpened by time. In the end, the relationship between Cronkite and Kennedy was far more tangled than most people realized. A biography of Cronkite by Douglas Brinkley revealed even more. It showed that Cronkite, for all his talk of journalistic neutrality, had deep ties with people in power, especially the Kennedys. At one point, he even worked closely with Bobby Kennedy during his presidential campaign. That kind of coziness would be a scandal today. Cronkite got access, and in return, the Kennedys got friendly coverage. The book argued that Cronkite's biggest ethical failure wasn't just bias, it was pretending he had none. And that's what made his later honesty so powerful. When he finally admitted that JFK wasn't the hero everyone believed, it didn't just shake up the Kennedy legacy, it shook up his own. The truth was hidden for decades, but now, newly released CIA documents show something that should shake everyone. The CIA knew far more about Lee Harvey Oswald than they ever admitted. And they didn't just stay quiet. They lied, again and again. It started back in November 1959. That's when Oswald defected to the Soviet Union. From that moment, CIA counterintelligence, led by James Jesus Angleton, began watching him. They even intercepted his mail. This wasn't some brief check. The surveillance went on for 4 straight years. It didn't stop until just weeks before John F. Kennedy was murdered in Dallas. In late 1963, Oswald showed up in Mexico City. He visited both Soviet and Cuban embassies. That alone should have raised every red flag. But when questioned later, the CIA acted like they barely noticed. Richard Helms, who would later become the CIA director, told the Warren Commission in May 1964 that the agency had probably minimal knowledge of Oswald. That was a lie, and not just a small one. In April 2025, Jefferson Morley told the House Oversight Committee that 3 senior CIA officials had misled investigators. This wasn't a mistake. It was deception. Think about it. Why lie unless there was something to hide? The truth is, these lies didn't just hurt the investigation. They destroyed it. Both the Warren Commission and the House Select Committee were left blind on the biggest question. Was Kennedy killed by one man? Or was it something bigger? And the timing makes it worse. In 1961, JFK had fired the CIA's own director. He even said he wanted to splinter the CIA into 1,000 pieces and scatter it into the winds. Just 2 years later, he was dead. Now, with these files out in the open, the cover-up is no longer a theory. It's documented. The CIA knew. The CIA watched. and the CIA stayed silent when it mattered most. This isn't just about the past, it's about the lies that shaped history.